Welcome back. This is the second video on the first part of the Phaedo. In the last video, we introduced the forms. In this video, I'd like to talk through the recollection argument as it's presented in the Phaedo. So we talked last time about how the recollection argument establishes that the soul exists before the body was born, and so is going to contribute to this overall argument that the soul is immortal. And now I want to look at how exactly Plato makes the recollection argument in the Phaedo. So the recollection argument in the Phaedo, it begins at 73C, 73C, 74A. And, you know, if you haven't read this section from 73C down to 75D, then I suggest you go ahead and read that now. I mean, really, you should read to 77A. I mean, this is really where it ends. That's sort of the chunk that I'm going to be talking about in this video. So it begins at 73C, and it begins with a definition of recollection. So the definition of recollection is that A puts us in mind of B, or A reminds us of B, if upon seeing A, B is brought to mind, or B is we're reminded of B, or our previous knowledge of B comes to the fore. So maybe a non-circular way to put that is A puts us in mind of B, or A reminds us of B, if upon seeing A, our previous knowledge of B comes to mind. And Plato gives a series of examples. So he says, well, suppose you see a lyre, you'll think of the person who plays it. Suppose you see Simmias, you might think of Cabes. You see a picture of Simmias, you're reminded of Simmias, right? So a pretty familiar phenomenon. The next step of the argument happens at 74B to C. And the idea here is that the equal itself and equal things can't be the same. Why can't the equal itself and, say, the equal sticks be the same? Well, the equal sticks can appear to be unequal. So they can appear to not be the same length. And maybe their equality isn't quite perfect. Maybe they're not perfectly equal. But when it comes to the equal itself, we can't make sense of what it would mean for the equal itself not to be equal, Plato thinks. We can't make sense of the equal itself not being perfectly equal. Why? Well, it's a characteristic that things in the world have, and it's the standard of equality, right? It's the standard that defines what the equal is. And so we can't imagine the equal being unequal. That would be contradictory. Okay, so that's sort of the next step. We'll develop that further as we go farther. The third step at 74D to 75A is that equal things will put us in mind of, or remind us of, the equal. How so? Well, the equal, as I was just saying, is the perfect thing, or the standard through which we recognize equal things. And so the idea is, when we see equal sticks, like this little f here, so we'll suppose the little f is the equal sticks. When we see the equal sticks, that puts us in mind of the equal. Why? Well, because the equal is the perfect equal. The big F is the perfect little f. The form of equality is the perfect characteristic of this or that. You know, it's the perfect version of this or that equality of the sticks, or 2 volumes of water, or 2 colors. And so this is really the key idea. And we'll come back to this in the next video, because I want to spell out the picture of judgment that Plato is developing through this thought here. I mean, and that's going to be the key to the account of knowledge. But we'll come back to that in the next video. For now, let's just see how the argument works, and then we'll spell out this thought of, about the equal sticks and judgment in the next video. So the next step in the argument comes at 75a. And the idea there is that in this life, all knowledge begins with sense perception. So as soon as we start breathing, as soon as we're born, we start perceiving things and sensing things around us. And everything that we perceive through the senses is imperfect, right? So all we can get through the senses are little f's. That's all we ever come into contact with through the senses, like the equal sticks, right? Next step. Nonetheless, we can recognize this imperfection. We recognize that the equal sticks are imperfect. How do we do this? How is this possible? We've only ever come into contact with imperfect things, like the sticks, or the 2 volumes of water, or the 2 instances of brown, right? We've only come into contact with imperfectly equal things. And so how do we recognize that they're imperfectly equal, that they're not perfectly equal? Where does this knowledge of the perfectly equal come from? It can't come through the senses, because everything we encounter through the senses is imperfect. So we must have had knowledge of the perfect from before we started sensing the forms. Therefore, we must have had knowledge of the forms from before we were born, because once we're born, we only sense. That's how we come to know things. And yet we have these standards, these perfect standards by which we can compare and recognize the imperfection of the things that we're encountering through the senses. So there must be some other source of knowledge besides the senses that was there before we were born, namely the forms. And so we must have had knowledge of the forms before we were born. So that's the idea. That's the recollection argument in the Phaedo. And yeah, as you can see, it's more developed than the version that we saw in the Meno. We'll come back to how in the next 2 videos. Okay, I will see you in the next video.